Lily, will the video be played once again after the start?
Thank you, Leah. Welcome, everybody. We sincerely welcome our distinguished guest, Professor Dr. Inge Wardiman-Joyanegoro. Thank you for attending this special event. It is a great pleasure for us to welcome Dr. Lydia Kieven, Professor Willem van der Molen, and Adrian Perkasa, the initiators of this Panji meeting. We also want to welcome and thank all speakers for preparing a presentation for this special meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third Panji meeting. The Wacana team, Susi Muimam, Regina Ediono, Dina Nawangringrum, Leah Runita, and myself, Lily Roseman, are honored to have you at this event. Today, we hold a follow-up meeting of Wacana double issue on Panji Stories, which was published in April 2020. The special double issue of Wacana, Journal of the University of Indonesia, on Panji Stories was prepared by Wacana, and If I will let you see the
91,4 und wir schauen, wie voll die Straßen an diesem Montag um kurz nach 9 sind.
Okay. Well, this is the special double issue of Wacana June of the Ministry of Indonesia on Panji stories. Was prepared by Wacana under the direction of Susi Muiman in collaboration with Clara from Vereniging KITLV and Lydia Kieven from Bonn University. The digital version of the edition Panji stories is accessible for free. You can find it at the new website of Wacana. This meeting, as initiated by Dr. Lydia Kieven, Professor Willem van der Molen, and Adrian Perkasa, MA, and supported by Dr. Susi Muiman, present 3 speakers and will be led by Adrian Perkasa, one of the contributors in Panji Stories issues. Dr. Lydia Kieven will tell us about this Panji meeting. Ibu Lydia is a researcher and lecturer at the University of Bonn and expert in ancient Javanese art, in particular of East Javanese temple reliefs. She obtained her PhD degree at the University of Sydney with a thesis following the cat figures in Majapahit temple reliefs. For many years, she has been active in programs on the Panji traditions in Java. Before we listen to Ibu Lydia, we will see the video of the obituary of Clara made by Susi Muiman. Distinguished guests, we hope you will have a pleasant meeting. Leah, please, the video of Clara Brakel.
Yeah. We have recently lost our beloved colleague and friend, Clara Brakel-Pappenhuizen. As a special guest editor, we worked intensively with Clara in compiling and preparing the publication of the double edition on Stories and Storytelling 1 and 2 in 2016. Again, as the result of the excellent academic cooperation of co-editing with Clara and the Panji expert Lydia Kieven, the double edition on Panji Stories 1 and 2 was published in 2020. Clara and Lydia played an important role in organizing the first 2 webinars on Panji Stories and in stimulating the discussion on all aspects of Panji. Thanks to Clara's inspiration and enthusiasm, the activity of discussion on Panji were able to continue until the present day.
You are still mute, Ibu Lydia. Please unmute your microphone.
Yeah, thank you, Susi, for this very touching presentation and obituary. Me too. I just want to also start with my first words. I am very grateful to Clara Brakel, who did all this cooperation, this wonderful cooperation with many of us. Yeah, let me introduce, I do not have to introduce me, but I just want to give a warm welcome to all of the participants. I'm very happy, and many of us are happy that we meet together here. You are many of you from Indonesia, I see, from Australia, from the Netherlands, from Germany, from France. Maybe later there will even be more from other countries. The point is, as we saw already in the presentation by Bu Lili from Wacana, the background is that the Panji Stories volumes were published in 2020 by Wacana in co-edition with Clara Brakel and with Susi Moimam. And this was a wonderful cooperation. I want to say a special thanks for last time, also for now, to house this meeting to Susi Moimam, the managing director of Vachana, to Bu Lili Rosman, who is the editor-in-chief, and to the team of Vachana, Lea, Badina, Regina. Thank you very much, for this wonderful cooperation. The other background was that before editing the Panji Stories volumes, there had been many activities on Panji in the Panji Symposium in Leiden, also in a panel in Oxford University in 2017. So this all is an outcome of a long process. We had a first meeting when the Panji Stories volumes was published, and it was in the very beginning of the pandemic, and it was for many of us still an experiment in using Zoom. We had a meeting of the 14 authors, celebrated, having a champagne, and then we got aware there is so much more to be done in research on Panji, so that we decided we will do another meeting the following year, which we did last year. It was a wonderful cooperation, which I then had again with Vachana and especially with Clara Brakel, almarhum. And just a few weeks before we had the meeting in September last year, she got seriously ill. So she could only attend the meeting then without video, but she attended. And we had presentations on Bayang Gedok, on reliefs, on Topeng, on Bayang Beber. So this was already part of the bunch of flowers of Panji. You see in the background, there's a little bunch of flowers, and I feel like this bunch should become greater and greater because there are so many aspects. Each of the roses represents one of the topics. I just gave a presentation on Panji and Durga in the Borobudur Writers Festival, which just was over yesterday. It was from Thursday to Sunday. So people might think, hey, what is Panji and Durga? Anyway, one of the flowers. You might search for it on YouTube of the Borobudur Writers Festival. Last time we were 37 participants. Now at the moment I see 22. I hope there will be a few more. I got already some excuses by people who cannot attend, but they will certainly watch the video later. The last words that Clara Brakel gave to me in our last phone talk was, Lydia, keep going with Panji. I do. So now we have our third meeting, and the team of the curators, I would say, the initiators, it is Willem van der Molen. Willem is a professor of philology and Old Javanese at Universitas Indonesia. And in 2018, retired from the KITLV, the Koninklijk Instituut voor Taalland en Volkenkunde in Leiden, as a researcher. He published a history of Javanese literature, an introduction to Old Javanese, and I cannot mention the whole long list of his publications. Just want to mention one. It is the new Romanized edition of the Old Javanese Ramayana, published in 2015. His present research focuses on the early 19th century Panji Panibo. Our moderator will be Adrian Perkasa. He's a lecturer in the Department of History in Universitas Erlangga, Surabaya. And he received his bachelor's in History and International Relations from that university with his thesis on Chinese Muslims in Majapahit. Currently, he is a PhD candidate at the University of Leiden, and his dissertation project is on the cultural network in Java and their role to the Javanese and to Indonesian nationalism. He's also broadening his research interest to how cultural nationalism developed in Asia and Africa in the 20th century. He will be the moderator. And please, I just want to let you know now already, after the presentations of the speakers, we have time. And it should not only be the discussions of the papers, but also I invite all of you, of the participants, to join in giving your own ideas for research topics for the future. This is one of the ideas which we have in this meeting. It's not only the presentations, but a discussion. So I just hand over to Adrian Perkasa. Silakan.
Okay, thank you very much, Bu Lydia. Hello, everyone. Good morning from Leiden. So I am Adrian Perkasa, and it's really delightful for me to welcome all of you, especially the speakers and all of the participants from all over the world. And now, in the main session, we will have 3 speakers that we are already in this meeting room. And the idea is the 3 of them will deliver the speech first. And if you have any question, comment, or feedbacks, we have more than, we hope more than 40 until 50 minutes to discuss it. And if you don't hesitate also to write your comment also in the chat room or the question there. So the first speaker, I will introduce Professor Peter Worsley. And yeah, before he deliver the speech, I will read his biography, the short biography. Peter Worsley is a formerly professor of Indonesian and Malayan studies at the University of Sydney. He's now Professor Emeritus attached to Indonesian Studies in the School of Languages and Cultures, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Sydney. He has written about the history of the arts and literature of pre-modern Java and of Bali, exploring Javanese and Balinese ideas about the nature of kingship and political culture, and how Javanese and Balinese imagine the environment in which they live and the larger cosmological order of which it was a part. Most recently, in a series of conference papers and published articles, he has discussed historiographical issues concerning the interpretation of 19th and early 20th centuries Balinese paintings. Okay, Professor Peter Worsley, the time is yours.
Thank you. Is the presentation, my slides there to be put up? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I will say.
Okay.
So it can, yeah, everyone
That's
can
fine.
see right.
I'll have to ask you to move each of the slides as I speak. Okay. Before I begin, I'd like to say a word of thanks to those who've organised this present webinar: Lydia, Adrian, Willem, Ibu Lily, and the other staff of Wacana, who have provided the opportunity for me to say something about the kidung Wargasari this evening. It's evening here. It's all sorts of times of the day everywhere else, I think. At the present moment, Willem van der Mol and I are in the process of editing a book, which we hope to see published very soon. The book contains Margaret Fletcher's edition, translation, and commentary on the kidung Wargasari, about which I'm going to talk this afternoon. Stuart Robson's edition and translation of the kidung Witaraga, and an essay by Hadi Sidomulyo on the historical and geographic setting of these 2 15th century kidung. My own interest was drawn to the kidung Wargasari when Margaret Fletcher first decided to edit, translate, and comment on the work as a project for her BA honours thesis at the University of Sydney in the 1980s. The kidung is, of course, not a Panji story, but it does share with Panji narratives a number of important, can I have the next slide? A number of important characteristics and thematic interests. The casting of the narrative metrically as a kidung, and its narrative interest in journeying, marriage, and the play of human emotions. In the kidung, the author recounts the story of the orphaned Wargasari, who grew to marriageable age in Wawuti in Eastern Java in the home of his grandmother, Datu Nareshwari. Weary of the young man's dissolute behaviour, the grandmother exhorted him to change his ways and to lead a virtuous life. She urged him to travel to Majapahit to seek ordination from his grandfather, Mpu Padalugan, the Buddhist Dhammajaksha there. The poem describes the young man's travels and marriages, the first to his second cousin, Vedarashmi, the lovely daughter of the Buddhist Astapaka of Sapukul, and then to Narawati, the beautiful daughter of the Atungu Dharma of the same establishment, the Buddhist establishment. In the world, as the author of the Kidung Wargasari imagined it to be, journeying and marriage are closely linked. The poet describes the stories of 4 journeys in the Kidung Wargasari. The first journey is undertaken by Wargasari from his home in Wawuti, somewhere to the south of present-day Gura, to Sapukul in the vicinity of present-day Wonu Agung. There he meets and marries his second cousin, Vedarashmi. The second journey is an account of Wargasari's elopement with Narawati and their flight from Sapukul to Majapahit, where he is ordained and succeeds his grandfather as Buddhist Dhammajaksha. The third journey is an account of his return from Majapahit to Sapukul to be reunited with his first wife, Vedarashmi, and to make peace with both sets of parents-in-law. And the fourth and final journey describes the trip back to Majapahit of the reunited couple, the parents-in-law, Wargasari's grandmother, and their retainers. It is on the second journey, the account of the elopement of Wargasari with Narawati to Majapahit, on which the poet has placed the greatest attention. Margaret, in her account of this journey, tells her readers the poet describes the terrain, the trees and plants, cultivated and uncultivated lands, dwellings and religious establishments, and provides us with the names of villages or districts through which Wargasari travels or which he observes. Importantly, Hadi Sidomulyo has recently been able to locate many of the place names and the topographical features of the landscape along the route which Wargasari and Narawati travel between the Buddhist Dastapakan and the Sapukul and Lamas Tulis, where Wargasari's grandfather resided as Buddhist Dhammajaksha of Majapahit. This, he points out, suggests that the landscape described in the Kidung was not a product of the author's imagination, but a description of the actual historical landscape of Eastern Java at the time when the poem was authored. Now, I don't want to dwell on this aspect of the journeys in the Kidung Wargasari. I'm sure Hadi will have much to say about this in his presentation, which will follow. However, there are 1 or 2 points that I think are important enough to make before I go on. The first concerns the effect of the poem's description of the historic landscape of Eastern Java. Can we change the next slide, please? That's the wrong, you have to go back. That's it there, that's fine. Let me go back. The first point I wanted to make concerns the effect of the poem's description of the historic landscape of Eastern Java has for the Kidung's author and its audience. For the author and audience familiar with the area of Eastern Java, the effect would have been to localize the events of the poem in a landscape well known to them. For 21st century commentators who are interested in understanding the motivations of 15th century authors and their audiences, perhaps we have here a hint that we might be confronted not with a fictional tale, but with a historical account of the journey of one young Javanese nobleman who was destined for ordination as the Buddhist Dhammajaksha of Majapahit. There are other historical accounts of journeys undertaken in the 14th and 15th century, which are known to us. The Desawarana is an extensive account of King Hayam royal tours about the landscape of his realm in the 14th century, and Bujanga Manik's pilgrimages suggest that there may have existed an interest in travel logs in the 14th and 15th century Java. We might add to these two works the kidung Witaraga, which might well be another historical account of a journey, on this occasion of an aging retired official who departs from Majapahit to meditate on the northern slopes of Mount Penanggungan. It is on another aspect of the journeying in the Wargasari which I want to talk, and on which Margaret Fletcher discussed at some length in her account. In her commentary, Fletcher draws on a passage from the Mahayana Buddhist Jinati Prakriti, a work which explains the rules governing the monk's behavior, arguing that the kidung's account of the journey of the poem's hero, Wargasari, as he elopes with Narawati, his bride-to-be, through the supernaturally charged wilderness of forested mountains to his grandfather's residence in Majapahit, was to be read metaphorically. In the journey of Wargasari's journeying, in the story of Wargasari's journeying, his love affairs and marriages, Fletcher recognized a pattern which Victor Turner, following Van Gennep, had identified in pilgrimages. This journey, she argues, was initiatory and marked a change in the status, both existentially and socially, in the life of the poem's hero, Wargasari. She points out that during the journey, as the couple experienced the dangers of the wilderness of forested mountains, Wargasari is transformed. Once a handsome but emotionally unstable adolescent, prey to his senses and lacking commitment, he becomes an adult, a person who has become a bastion of good behavior, someone fit to be instructed and ordained in the place of his grandfather as Mahayana Buddhist Dhammajaksha in Majapahit. As I have mentioned, it was Margaret's reading of the Mahayana Buddhist Jinati Prakriti which convinced her that the kidung's account of Wargasari's journey was to be read metaphorically. In this text, the body is likened to the sea and the forested mountains, and the physical dangers and impediments of both are acquainted with the emotional imperfections of man, which have to be overcome in order to attain Siddhahood. As their journey progresses and Wargasari and Narawati experience and overcome the hazards which lie on their way, they are rewarded with glimpses of another kind of landscape, one like the countryside, cleared and productive and devoid of the obstacles which stand in the way of their emotional progress. The turning point of the story, Fletcher argues, was at the moment at which the couple make love for the first time while overnighting in the residence of a buyut, and the following morning bathe in its pool before Wargasari performs Dewashraya, a ritual. Fletcher suggests that this sequence of events, this sequence of actions, lovemaking, bathing, and ritual, points to the performance of a specific kind of tantric yoga. Proof of Wargasari's changed condition and emotional stability comes when Narawati's brother confronts the couple. His bellicose insistence that Wargasari should surrender his sister is met not with aggression, but calm refusal. To abandon the union he had formed with Narawati, Fletcher explains, would mean he had failed in his purpose and lost the channel which linked him to the divine. It's perhaps worth noting here that as a young man destined for high Buddhist office, the calm refusal of Wargasari when confronted by the violent demands of Narawati's angry brother, no doubt inspired by his right to recover his kidnapped sister, is in stark contrast to that of the princely Kshatriya Aja in the Kakawin Sumanasantaka, when rival suitors engage him in armed contest for control of Princess Indumati, his queen-to-be. In Wargasari's case, there can be no question of violence when he insists on the need of his coupling with Narawati. In the case of Prince Aja, as a Kshatriya warrior, his abounden duty destined him to engage in the violence of battle to settle his claim to union with his future queen. Recently in my reading, I've come across discussion of the way in which dominant Western post-Enlightenment accounts concerning the nature and the social and cultural life of colonized peoples have diverted attention away from the need to understand how colonized indigenous peoples themselves imagined the world they inhabited, the epistemological grounds on which their imaginings were founded, and importantly, also from consideration of the shape in which indigenous discourses were cast. Our knowledge concerning the social, moral, creative, and spiritual life of these peoples was given expression in the form of narratives, song cycles, prayers, dances, art, architecture, and ritual. Now, I believe that Margaret's account of the journey in Wargasari makes some valuable suggestions about the way in which 15th century Javanese understood the world, about the presuppositions on which informed their understandings, and the shape in which these understandings were cast. In pre-colonial Java, narratives were a preferred form in which accounts of the social, moral, and spiritual life of Javanese were explained and cast in the form of epic Kakawan or kidung. Poets in aristocratic courts, and no doubt others, also gave expression to, and their audiences found confirmation of the foundations of their social existence and reinforcement of the hegemonic authority of kings who ruled over them in narratives, were cast in narratives, cast in the form of epic Kakawan and kidung. Furthermore, we know that at least in the case of epic Kakawan, authoring the poem was a ritual which was intended to transform the world. While this is perhaps true of Kakawan, it is at this moment unclear whether or not the composition of kidungs shared this practice as a form of ritual action. In these epic works, ancient Javanese poets organized their narrative accounts of the world as tales of journeys, or tales in which journeys were an important conceptual motive. The journeys traversed different environments. Distinctions were drawn in these travelogues between the social world of palace and countryside, of wilderness, a wilderness of seashore and forested mountains, and a world in which gods, ancestral spirits, and other divine beings dwelt. Each of these categories had its own special characteristics. The beings who were indigenous to each one, the architectural structures and topographical features native to each, the activities and emotions which prevailed, and this list could be added to include the sounds, colors, and fragrances which were characteristic of each space. Importantly, the social world was characterized by the presence of an effective royal authority, the wilderness antithetically by its absence. The wilderness was thought of as a liminal zone, embodying the emotional hazards which stood in the way of altered existential and social status. Accounts of journeys across these spaces are of enduring interest in the literary traditions of ancient Java and suggest that the poets of epic Kakawan and Kidung imagined a world of human experience in which there was no essential difference in efficacy between the human and divine, the living and the dead, and between waking and experiences and dreams. There is a focus in the poem on human emotions. In her discussion of Wargasari and Narawati's elopement, Margaret notes the emphasis placed on the disciplining of Wargasari's emotions. His suitability for ordination as Buddhist Dhammajaksha of Majapahit appears in the world of the kidung is less the result of religious instruction than it is the product of his elopement with Narawati and his experience of his passage through the wilderness of forested mountains, which, as we have seen in the Buddhist Jinati Prakriti, is described as embodying the hazards of human emotional frailty. And then there is his ritual copulation with Narawati. The hero of the story, Wargasari, enters two quite different forms of marriage. His marriage to Witaraga is an arranged marriage to his second cousin, approved by parents, approved by parents of the bride and the groom. His marriage to Narawati is an elopement which lacks parental approval. Interestingly, Wargasari's suitability for ordination as Buddhist Dhammajaksha in Majapahit is linked not to his marriage with Witaraga, but to his elopement with Narawati and the trials they undergo, traversing the hazards of their journey through and their ritual coupling in the forested and mountainous wilderness on their way to Majapahit. Margaret's remarks concerning her metaphorical reading of the journeys and the wilderness landscape of forested mountains in the kidung, Wargasari, suggest that we're dealing with a cosmology in which metaphysical metaphors bear a significant conceptual load in explanations of the world. But perhaps before we accept that we're just dealing here with metaphors and allegories, figures of speech familiar to modern literary commentators or perhaps we should consider the possibility that we're dealing here with the product of quite a different style of thought and different understanding of the world and of causality, one in which humankind and the world they inhabit are imagined to be bound together effectively, one in which words spoken and actions performed in ritual work effect transformations, one in which ancient Javanese poets and their audiences imagined that the accounts of journeying in epic Kakawan and Kidung actually transformed the poet-priest seeking apotheosis or young men and women transitioning from childhood to adulthood. Perhaps we're dealing here with an understanding of the world in which not likenesses, but equivalences are thought to exist and identities are shared between the macrocosmos and the microcosmic constitution of human beings. That's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Peter. It's indeed very punctual timing in 15 minutes. And before I, as moderator, actually remind you, the speaker, we have actually 15 minutes for each speaker to deliver his speech in order to ensure that our discussion will be much more fruitful, fully. Okay, the next one, I will invite the following speaker, Pak Hadi Sidomulyo. Okay, and before he delivered his speech, I will briefly introduce him. Pak Hadi Sidomulyo is an independent writer and historian with a special interest in the topography of ancient Java. Publications include Napak Tilas Perjalanan Empu Prapanca in 2007, Kertanegara and the Resurrection of Empu Barada in 2011, and more recently a new English language edition of the old Javanese Tantu Panggelaran entitled Threads of the Unfolding Web in the previous years, 2021, and prepared in collaboration with Stuart Robson. I invite Pak Hadi Sidomulyo to deliver his lecture. Pak Hadi, the time is yours.
Thank you. So can you help also to change the slides, yeah, when I ask you?
Sure.
So when I first submitted the title of this discussion, it's quite a, Ibu Lydia said, wow, that's a broad topic. And it is indeed. Of course, I'm fully aware that it can hardly be dealt with adequately in 15 minutes. Even so, I would like to use this opportunity to introduce the Kidung Panji Margasmara, the Wargasari, and the Witaraga all together, as they would seem to be natural companions. Of course, many of you will remember that these same three texts with an accompanying synopsis of each form the basis for a publication entitled Notes on the Early Kidung Literature, prepared more than 40 years ago by Stuart Robson. As Peter Worsley has already mentioned, all these texts are concerned essentially with the journey as transformation. In the Panji Margasmara and the Wargasari, the journey prepares the protagonist for high office, the Mahapati and the Buddhist Dharma Vyasa, respectively. While in the Witaraga, it leads to a retirement from the world, become a hermit. Now, of particular interest are the numerous topographical details encountered in the descriptions of these journeys. The fact that many of them are quite obscure, yet still verifiable today, strongly suggests that the authors were personally familiar with the landscape which they depicted. This in turn supports the tentative conclusion drawn by Stuart Robson. These works, notwithstanding a few additions and alterations by later copyists, were originally composed in Java, in East Java, during the 15th century. So as such, it would seem inappropriate perhaps to regard them as recreations of the Javanese age of Majapahit. On the contrary, we get the distinct impression that the authors were motivated, at least in part, by a nostalgia for the age of King Raja Sanagara and his Pati Gajah Mada, whose memory would have been very much alive when they were writing. Could just be then that their compositions can shed some light on the history of the period in question. Since the time is limited, I can do no more than select just one example from each of these three kidung to serve as an illustration. I'll start with the Panji Margasmara. And well, yes, we can have the slide in a minute, but I'll just introduce it. Beginning with the Panji Margasmara, one of the central features in the story concerns the appointment to the throne of a new king in Majapahit. And the author informs us that the inauguration process was accomplished in two stages. Firstly, there was a ritual purification. Then a few months later, official installation as divine sovereign, Dewa Prabu. These two stages are indicated respectively by the words astri, consecration, purification, and astu, or approval, recognition, in the sense of divine sanction. So now can we have the first slide? So the first slide, yes. So now the text of the Panji Margasmara makes it quite clear that the initial consecration, the unnamed crown prince, or the young king, who's referred to as Narendra Anon, it took place at Rabut Pala, the state temple of Majapahit. which is identifiable today with the remains of Candi Panataran at Blitar. Now, the prince and his retinue are said to have resided at Pala for about a month. Next slide, please. Now, as to the royal encampment, which is described in some detail, this could well have been located at the place known as Umpak Balai Kamban, which lies within a short walking distance from the main temple. At this place, we find 36 very large stone pillar supports ranged in 3 rows of 12 and oriented north-south in an elevated terrace. Now, according to J.L.A. Brandes, who described this site more than a century ago, this configuration would have supported a wooden pavilion measuring no less than 50 meters in length. Next slide, please. Now, an important detail, which was apparently missed by Brandes, is the presence of an inscribed date on one of the pillar supports, which gives an unambiguous reading of Saka 1272. That's AD 1350. Now, this, of course, coincides precisely with the accession to the throne of the young King Hayamuruk, who celebrated his 16th birthday in that same year. Could it be that the site of Umpak Balai Kamban was initially built for the consecration of King Hayamuruk and subsequently functioned as the royal Panataran from that time onwards? This suggestion, of course, is difficult to prove, but I believe that the mere presence of the above-mentioned date makes the argument irrefutable. After all, for what other possible reason would a building of such dimensions be commissioned at Rabu Pala in the year of the king's accession to the throne? So it thus could be that the author of the Panji Margasmara is providing us with important information about the inauguration process for Majapahit sovereigns. As to the unnamed young king of the Kidung, this might be an allusion to Hayamuruk himself, with whom the custom perhaps originated in the mid-14th century. Moving on to the Wargasari, perhaps the slide we can get rid of the slide now for the moment. Perhaps just have it blank for the moment. I'll just introduce the next topic. Is it possible? Yeah. Turning to Wargasari, both Stuart Robson and Margaret Fletcher have drawn attention to the predominantly Buddhist setting of Hadi. Margaret Fletcher goes on to add pertinently that the marital relations between the families of the Atungu Dharma of Sapukul and Sagala provide a strong argument for identifying the latter, that is Sagala, with the Dharma of that name, which was described by Prapancha in his Desa Warnana. This monument is said to have been built for King Kartanagara of Singasari and housed a dual image of the deities Vairocana and Lochana. Unfortunately, Fletcher's inability to locate the Sagala of the Wargasari prevented her from carrying her argument through to its logical conclusion. Next slide, please. Yeah. So considering that the names Sagala and Sajabu are used alternatively in the Wargasari to describe the same location, it's in fact not difficult to identify the Dharma in question with the present hill resort of Jabung, which lies just 10 kilometers south of present-day Trawulan. This placement is in complete accordance with the description of the final section of Wargasari's journey from Sapukul to Majapahit, which followed a route northwards to Majapahit from Sidomanis, which followed a route northwards from Sidomanis to Sajabung and from there to Kumitir. The toponym Sidomanis is identifiable today with the hamlet of Sidolagi at Sumbarajo, 6 kilometers south of Jabung, while a village named Kumitir is still to be found where we would expect it, 6 kilometers to the north on the eastern side of Trawulan. Next slide, please. Additional support for the identification of Jabung as the site of a royal dharma is provided by the significant archaeological remains discovered in the immediate vicinity. One could in fact surmise that the foundations of the monument at Sagala lie hidden today beneath the grave complex of Ki Ageng Jabung, where a large octagonal yoni pedestal was recovered in 2006. This monument, this yoni is now preserved in the Traveler Museum. Next slide. Not far to the west, near the probable entrance to the site, lie 34 large stone pillar supports arranged in 3 rows. I could add that the placement of Sagala at present-day Jabung is in complete accordance with the surviving archaeological evidence, which points to Kertanegara's personal interest in the Mojokerto region, perhaps anticipating the subsequent shift of the power center to Mojopahit. And the next slide, please. So now we move on to the third kidung, Witaraga. And this photograph I took 25 years ago at Trawulan, and it shows the full moon rising over Mount Penanggungan, the eastern mountain of the text, which was quite obviously, but evidently, the pilgrim's destination. Next slide. So upon arrival at the foot of the mountain at dawn, Witaraga is said first to have passed by an abandoned bathing place. This is possibly identifiable with the 10th century remains of Jolotundo, which can be found on Penanggungan's western side. Perhaps they were already in a ruinous state in the Majapahit period. Next slide. From there, he climbed up the mountain slope, and after some time reached a crossroads, where he's said to have looked down on all the scenery and caught sight of a white sail flapping in the distance, probably a ship heading for Canggu, we thought. Canggu is the ancient river port of Majapahit. The crossroads were thus situated at a point on Mount Penanggungan's northern side. Given the probable route followed up the western slope of the mountain, we can place them tentatively not far above a site known today as Candi Sinta, where 4 ancient pathways converge, and this is where the photograph is taken from, where it's possible to view a glimpse of the River Porong as well as the Straits of Madura. Next slide. According to the text, these crossroads bore the name Tarajon and represented the meeting point of the Chatur Asrama, or the 4 directions. It could thus be that the Kidung Witaraga can tell us something about the sacred sites on Mount Penanggungan, and in particular the relationships between them. This is clearly a subject for further study. So to conclude, while the 3 narratives under discussion may be regarded as fiction, it seems likely that they allude to actual places, events, offices, and institutions that existed during the age of Majapahit. Treated cautiously, they can thus serve as valuable historical sources. And next slide, last slide. Final word, I'd just like to take this opportunity to draw attention to the recent publication of the Kidung Panji Margasmara, which has been masterfully edited and translated by Stuart Robson. As Pat Stewart notes in his introduction, however, this is definitely not a Panji story in the strict sense of the term, despite the title. On the other hand, it does share many similarities with the mainstream Panji tradition. It further appears to have a recorded date of composition, Saka 1380, AD 1458. It's therefore very useful for comparison when considering the development of Panji literature in general. Thank you. I think that's it for me.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Hadi. Actually, from the 2 speakers, I had many questions. I believe that many of you also have many questions, and please feel free to write down if you have any question or comments to the previous speech from Pak Hadi and Pak Peter in the chat room before we enter the discussion session that I will also lead you after the last speaker. So last but not least, we have another speaker from this session. I will read her biography first. The last speaker is Clara Gilbert, is a French PhD candidate in anthropology at École d'études en sciences sociales, Paris, EHESS. She first worked on the transmission of the Javanese mask theater Wayang Topeng in Central Java, Indonesia, which is framed on the Panji stories for her master degree in 2006 to 2018. Then in her PhD dissertation from 2018 to 2022, she focuses on the contemporary issues and modalities of representation of this Javanese mask theater in the city of Yogyakarta. In the present paper, she will deal with, in particular, with the forms. Okay, and Bu or Mbak Clara, now the time is yours.
Good morning. Do you hear me?
Yes, it's
Okay,
clear.
fine, thank you. So yeah, Mas Adrian, I will ask you to change my slide, please. Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very glad to be able to give a presentation today. So yeah, I will first introduce my broad research. So I started my research in Yogyakarta in Indonesia. Oh, yeah, you can change the slide, please, for the first one. Thank you. I mean the second one with the map. Yeah, thank you. I started my research in 2016 in Yogyakarta, and at that time I was working with the dance group Ndarem Pujakusuman in the transmission of Javanese dance, and especially the Wayang Topeng dance. I continue my work in PhD in 2019, working with the dance association Kriba Wiksawirama in Yogyakarta, which is the oldest dance school in Yogyakarta, who still transmitted the Wayang Topeng mask theater. So, okay, you can change the slide, please, for the third one. Thank you. So, the coronavirus pandemic, which arrived in March 2020 in Java, had several consequences on the Javanese performing art. The sanitary measure taken by the government in March to limit the spread of the virus led first of all to the shutting down of all artistic activities. It resulted in the closure of public places, performance hall, dance training places, and the cancellation of planned performances. In June, these events were postponed online. Secondly, in October 2020, I attended to a relative period of cool down of sanitary measure due to the decrease in contamination. I attended to an unexpected revival of the Wayang Topeng performances in Yogyakarta, with the will of Ministry of Culture and Tourism, Dinas Kebudayaan dan Pariwisata, to diversify the tourist offer proposed by the Sidomulyo Museum. The goal exposed by the Sidomulyo Museum was to take advantage to the closure of the borders to prepare a new performance program for international and local tourists when the borders reopen. Okay, you can change the slide, please. So during the pandemic, I worked with the group Kriba Wiksawirama, which was one of the groups that the Sidomulyo Museum called upon for the preparation of this project. The first consequence of the pandemic on performing arts, and especially Wayang Topeng performances during the pandemic, is a new setup of performances in accordance to the sanitary measure. That meant that the performances were set in a closed room. The audience has to detect the temperature before entering. There was hand washing places also for the audience. The room was limited to 50 people with seats of 1 meter apart. And all this new setup goes against the traditional framework of representation, which is normally popular, outside, and lasts all day, 7 hours. It's also free for the audience, and here, in the special case, the audience has to pay for attending the show. That's why, in fact, the audience was quite limited. It was mostly a student of the Yogyakarta Institute of Art and the member of dancer communities. So I mean that the audience was quite restricted. There was not much common people, maybe also because of the entrance fee. So yeah, this new setup changed a lot, in fact. You can change the slide, please. The second main change is the adaptation of the Panji story in the coronavirus context. In the special case, during the pandemic, the Sidomulyo Museum asked to the Wirama Association to play the folk tale Ande Ande Lumut, which is a Javanese East tale for children in which Panji characters were added. So I will just give you a short summary of this plot. So after the earthquake, Chandrakirana and Panji are reincarnated into two false characters. Panji becomes Ande Ande Lumut, the son of Burando Dadakan, and Chandrakirana became Klanting Kuning, the servant of Burando Klanting. Burando Klanting with her 4 girls make Chandrakirana life very hard, actually. Ande Ande Lumut, who want to marry, decide to organize a huge event and invite all the young girls of the village around in order to meet the woman he will marry. Of course, Burando Klanting forbid Klanting Kuning to attend the event, but at the end, she managed to go. And when she met with Panji, they recognize each other as Panji and Chandrakirana and are united again. So that's the plot in a short line. But my point here is that in the context of the coronavirus performances, this show was adapted in order to relink with the context. Okay, you can change the slide, please. So we can see some innovation in the performance. For example, here we can see Burando Klanting. She used a mobile phone, and actually she just received by WhatsApp the invitation of Ande Ande Lumut for the event he will organize to find his new bride. So the invitation is sent by WhatsApp, and the mobile phone is used on the stage. At this special moment, Burando Klanting want to share the invitation with her 4 girls. And when the 4 girls come closer to her, then she screams and asks them to go away from 1 meter apart in order to respect the sanitary measure and the social distancing. That's an important point. In another moment of the show, Klanting Kuning enters, and because she seems to be dirty, Burando Klanting used hand sanitizer and spread it all over the stage in order to clean up the stage from Klanting Kuning's dirt. She will also use the hand sanitizer to wash her hand and give it to the 4 girls, who will also wash their hands. In another moment of the performance, Burando Klanting will use the sampur, which is the scarf she has around her waist, to use it as a mask in order to be protected from the coronavirus. So it's important here to know that the COVID, the pandemic, enters the wayang topeng performance and the modernity also, as we can see with the mobile phone and the use of WhatsApp on stage. You can change the slide, please. Now I have another point here, which is quite important also, is that the performance has to follow the guideline of the creative industry in order to make the wayang topeng performance a form of entertainment. Indeed, here the comical scene play a main part in the performance. We can see here, for example, in the first pictures in the left side, this picture was taken after the entering of Burondok Lenting in the stage. She entered, she jumped all over the stage and then did some acrobatic figures before falling down dramatically. So this moment is quite comical and entertaining for the audience. Another key moment is what we can see in the pictures in the right side, when Clanasi Wandono, which is a prince who wants to also marry Chandra Kirana or Planting Kuning, because he's mad of love, mistakes Yuyu Kankan, which is another character of the story, with Chandra Kirana. So this moment is also quite comical. Of course, the two clown servants, the Punakawan, Panchak and Doyok, that we can see in the left side, play an important part in the show, and their dance and intervention are also quite comical. And of course here, we have an important character which is quite special in this performance, is the introduction of Burondo Dadakan, played by a cross-gender dancer, Mastruko. This dancer is quite important and well known in Yogyakarta, and most of the audience come actually to see him dancing. So this cross-gender dancer has an important part in the show, and his intervention is also very comical. So my point here was to stress out the fact that in this context, the wayang topeng performance was mostly a comical show, according to the creative industry. Okay, you can change the slide now, please. Yeah, thank you. But of course, the three main storylines of the Panji story, which are the separation of Chandra Kirana and Panji, the quest for one another, and then the reunification at the end, are still the main part of the performance, but they are dramatized in order to be entertaining for the audience. We can see here in the left pictures the final fight of Panji and Clara Siwandono, which is also an important part in the performance. And at the end, of course, in the right side, the pictures of the unification of Panji and Chandra Kirana. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So I will give you a few words of conclusion. So I would like to conclude, sorry, in the fact that, yeah, on the one hand, the coronavirus pandemic has increased a new conception of wayang topeng performance that is becoming a product of cultural tourism, pariwisata budaya. It transformed the wayang topeng performance into a form of entertainment, tontonan, and removed the profound teaching content, tuntunan, of it. On the other hand, for the wayang topeng actor, it is very important and fundamental to preserve these dramatic forms, the dance, the song, but also the Javanese teaching that are an integral part of this dramatic form. In fact, Wayang Topeng drama and Panji stories tell the origin of Java's history and are deeply rooted in Javanese values called kejawen. In other words, Panji stories are part of the Javanese-ness, kejawaan, and are a part of cultural heritage, warisan kebudayaan. Okay, I finished. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for Clara and all of the speakers. Yeah, finally, all of the speakers have already delivered their speech, and now I think this is a really interesting session to respond all of them. And I also expect that you have already many ideas or feedbacks or comments that you want to ask. Just please raise your hand and then I will address you. But from now, I will take my liberty as a moderator to ask the first two speakers first. And then, maybe it can also ignite the discussion later on. Okay, to Pak Peter and Pak Hadi, would you please, elaborate more on the story of Panji Wargasari, the title of the presentation, and the Panji Margasmara also? Because I think, when I read the Lydia story, there are a mainstream of Panji story there. I mean, with the plot of, that already elaborated or explained by Ras and by Purbo Caroko, for instance, and this thing is the Panji Wargasari a bit different, but also I found that there are many similarities in it. And please, would you please point out the difference and also the similarities or even the connection with those kidungs and with the what I call mainstream Panji stories. Thank you. Peter and to Pak Hadi. And later to Clara, I also have a few remarks or feedbacks on you. But please, Pak Peter or Pak Hadi, would you please address my feedback?
Peter?
Do you want to go first, or?
Why don't you go first? You were the first speaker.
I can't say much more than I've already hinted at. Is that the Wargasari is focused on themes that you find in the Panji story. It's about marriages. The Panji stories are very varied. I'm more familiar with the Balinese Malat than I am with the Javanese Panji stories. But one of the themes is the searching out of the couple finding each other, and there are endless journeyings in order for that to take place. Now, there's no the Wargasari is much simpler than some of what I remember as being some of the more intricate and endless journeying that takes place between, and this, moving from one disguise to another until the lovers find themselves. But there's a clear interest in marriage, and in the Wargasari. I'm interested in the Wargasari because of the comments that Margaret made about the metaphorical reading of that, and I would include in that somehow the use of marriage. In the case of the Wargasari, it's got to do with a journey, a trial that takes place or is described through a journey, and the coming together of two lovers. But in that case, it seems to be necessary for the story that that refers to a tantric form of copulation between man and woman, as a means of achieving connections with the achieving a transformation in the beings of these two, in this case, two young people moving between childhood and adulthood. And if I remember rightly, I mean, I can't remember this now. They're very young. I mean, if I remember rightly, in the Wargasari, the ages are, they're just entering puberty. There's a reference there somewhere to Wargasari's being a very young man at the time of this, that the story starts at any rate. I mean, so I don't see this as a Panji story in any real sense at all. It just shares a number of themes with the Panji story: the question of marriage, the question of the focus on journeying, and on the play of human emotions. There's no doubt about it. In the Wargasari, a human being is a embodiment of emotion, and nothing else really. Adulthood comes with the maturing of one's emotional being. I mean, and that I mean, to what extent that is it was prominent in all the Panji stories, I can't comment on really.
Thank you, Pak Peter and Pak Hadi.
I'm certainly not an expert on Panji, on the mainstream Panji stories, but I have noticed I've had the opportunity, because now these three kidung, which I discussed, all of them have now recently been edited and translated. So we have the opportunity to read the full text and the full translations, which is wonderful. For that reason, I wanted to introduce them all together, because they do seem to share something in common, in that they, as I mentioned earlier, they probably written in the 15th century, and they reflect a nostalgia, perhaps, and an attempt, different from if we consider the mainstream Panji tradition as this is my opinion only, but I feel that the mainstream Panji tradition is it's a development. This is possibly a precursor, looking at a precursor. It's not they're not recreating Majapahit. This was a term which Margaret used in her Wargasari thesis. She talks about a recreation. You might consider the Malat to be a recreation of Majapahit Java. The three kidung under discussion here, you really see the elements, the original elements from Majapahit. It's not a recreation, it's the real thing. The authors were living in the 15th century, they were living in the Majapahit period, so they were describing conditions at that time. The feeling I get is that they're not historical texts, but they allude to historical, that they're attempting to preserve a tradition. I think in the 15th century that the Majapahit was undergoing somewhat of a crisis, and you have writers like Tanakung who are looking for inspiration from India. They're looking for new themes, and perhaps the kidung writers were the same thing. They were looking back. They were looking back to the great age of the 14th century, looking back to Hayam Wuruk and Gajah Mada, and they were one of the goals of one of the reasons for writing these kidung was to preserve a tradition which was in danger of, which was being eroded. And this is why these institutions and traditions and references to allusions to famous figures like Gajah and Hayam Wuruk, these were models which they attempted to recreate at the time when they were writing. So that they're not historical texts, but there was historical accuracy in the institutions and the temple sites, the journeys, the landscape. This was all very real. Now, as to the similarity with the Panji stories, you do see, and the Panji Margasmara in particular, this is very interesting because, in fact, the Wargasari is not, I mean, it's not called, as far as I know, that it's not the Panji Wargasari, it's the kidung Wargasari. So, but Margasmara is called Panji Margasmara, and he shares many qualities with the Panji of the mainstream tradition. The only difference is that there's no mention of Daha, there's no Chandrakirana, and in fact his wife, his bride-to-be, is in fact a princess of Singosari, which is very interesting. But his first wife dies, he goes off, he wanders, and he falls in love with a woman who's already betrothed to someone else. All these themes which you find in the Panji stories, the difficulties they undergo, their separation, they're reunited. These are all the things. He's also a gambler. He's a great lover. All women all fall in love with him, you know. And so all these themes which you find in the Panji tradition are already there in this Panji Margasmara. But it's, as Stuart Robson says, it's not a Panji story. It's because it doesn't contain those basic elements. There's no mention of Kadiri. It's Singosari and Majapahit. And one point actually which interested me when I read Rabacharako's book on Panji stories was that in that volume, the name Majapahit does not appear once, not a single time. Now, Panji Margasmara, Witaraga, and Wargasari, they're all set in Majapahit. They all focus on Majapahit. In fact, they all meet in the foothills of the mountains to the south of the city. They're all set, in fact, in that area. So there are similarities and differences. And I think this is very interesting to explore. Give someone else a chance to make a comment.
And maybe Bu Lydia already raised her hands. Please, Bu Lydia, you can add.
Yeah. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to Peter Worsley, to Hadi. Yeah, I had spoken to Hadi before that. We had met in Bali a while ago, and we were discussing these things, and I found it really very interesting. And I have a question again, because for me, of course, it is interesting. What is the difference? What is the similarity? Wonderful that you explained that. And I just wonder, as you say, the Panji Margasmara and the others were written in the 15th century, and they allude to his history, and you think they want to preserve the great tradition and maybe the golden era of Majapahit. And why is the name Panji used? So has the name Panji already been usual, popular, normal for a person like this this Tokoh, this protagonist in the story, or does it also, by using the name Panji, allude to the Panji stories, this big mainstream tradition of Majapahit? And what else? Yeah, that's it. That's my question. You understand?
Yes, yeah. Panji is a title, of course. Panji, I mean, we know this. Panji, I mean, Singosari, Majapahit, and what the name, the title Panji, it's so common. So my question is, the Panji of the mainstream tradition is the same. It's a title, isn't it? I mean, it's just a title, and Raden Inukratapati is his name, but we call him Panji. And I think Panji Margasmara is perhaps in that sense no different. Wargasari was not called Panji, it doesn't appear as Panji, and Witaraga also is not Panji. I think that what I think is more important is to try and establish a connection between I think the point you made about the mainstream Panji tradition of being a continuation, perhaps, of this, was this effort to preserve, was already, this is like a precursor of what came later. I may be completely wrong here, but I tend to follow Moderator, who believed that the Panji tradition, as we find it today, the mainstream Panji tradition, it occurred later. It was later in the literature. We're talking in the literature that's developed, a later development. On the other hand, you've also found Panji story on reliefs. Now, this is reliefs on Majapahit temples, like one in temple at Tulungagung. So we find perhaps a continuation there. But my question is, when those reliefs were carved, what was the name of the relief to the people who carved it? This is a question we can't answer. Was it called, sorry, I forget which was the reliefs on the Chandigambar at Tulungagung?
Nirigambar.
Nirigambar, yeah.
Wasangsari.
Wasangsari.
Yeah.
My question is, was it called Wasangsari in the 15th century?
Yeah,
I
it
don't
was
know.
a variation of it.
But we already, yeah.
Mm.
So perhaps this Panji Margasmara, for instance, is like a precursor. It's been developed then in the following century. The later writers were inspired by that story.
Yeah, that's right. We don't know the titles of the Panji stories in the reliefs, and if they
I
refer
could add
to
something
other,
here. I think it's wrong to look for direct connections between these things. I think you've got to understand that these stories are coming out of the same cultural imagination at a particular historical period, and types of heroic figures, the stereotyping of different kinds of women, the use of these motifs like journeys, they all come from a kind of an imaginative well, and the stories that the Panji stories come out of this same source as do these kidung that we're now talking about. I don't think you necessarily have got to find a direct connection or a direct comparison with them at all. I just think that it's culturally embedded in the same kind of way of imagining the world. And so you get the same kinds of figures turning up. The word, and I agree with Hadi, the Panji is a title, and it's used as a title in a lot of these texts. It's not it's become a way of referring to a particular kind of story. Who wears the hat that you talk about?
Okay, thank you. And okay, we have, so maybe we have another question is from Mas Wayan Jarah Sastrawan. You will address this issue, or you have another issue, Mas Wayan? And then we have also Pak Willem van der Molen after him. Please, Mas Wayan Jarah.
I have a few other issues, but thank you both. Thank you all for these really interesting questions. I've got lots of questions, but I'll try to keep under control. First, I'm interested in the social background of kidungs. We have these impressions about kidungs as being not as closely tied to royal patronage as kakawins are, more sort of out in the community, more diverse social backgrounds, but because we don't have as explicit mangalas or statements of authorship, it's not as easy to track that. So I wonder what, I think particularly to Peter, but also to Hadi as well, what are your thoughts about the social backgrounds, given that they seem to really revolve around courts, even when people go out to the countryside and do things, there's this sense in which the court pulls them back or shapes their development in the three texts that we've been focusing on today. Also, with Peter, if I could ask a second question, I was really interested in your final point about whether or not metaphor is a useful conceptual analytical concept to use, and whether we should perhaps not be thinking more in terms of equivalences rather than likenesses. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on that in terms of how that might actually look in practice when we read these texts and try to use such an approach. Do you think that such approaches have been fruitfully applied to Javanese texts in the past, or do you think that this is something that is a brand? It's kind of a completely different way of approaching old Javanese texts that we could fruitfully consider. Apologize. My next question is for Hadi. I really was fascinated by your discussion about the difference between recreation and tradition, and how we might not think of these texts as recreating Majapahit, but rather attempting to save and preserve and continue sorry, I think there was a disturbance there. I hope that Mas Adrian, are we still okay in terms of?
Yeah. It's you're back. You are back.
I'm back. Thank you. I'll be done soon. Do you think? I was interested in how you imagine these traditions having been carried through, say, from the 14th century through the 15th century, and then perhaps even later. Bearing in mind also we have other genres of kidung, like the quote-unquote historical kidungs, Ranggalawe, Hashawijaya, which seem to Sorandaka, which seem to very much be connected to the Pararaton as a sort of summary of the contents of those traditions, separate apparently, or quite distinct from the text that we've been talking about today. So I'm wondering what your imaginations are about whether this is, does it start out as a purely oral tradition, for example, stories about Majapahit and about these figures, eventually they're getting put in writing in the 15th century, when there's more of a revitalist sort of movement attempt to save the past. And final quick question also for Hadi, what other sites do you find these umpak evidence for sort of settlements or temporary dwellings or that kind of thing? I thought that was a really impressive demonstration at Umpak Balai Kambang with the being able to really show the existence of something described in the text right there. And I'm wondering how many other such places we can see evidence for places where it's likely that people gathered, pasabans, either in the context of royal progress or in terms of gathering together for other purposes. So thanks for your indulgence.
Thank you, Mas Wayanjara. Pak Willem, I hope you can please be patient after Pak Peter and Pak Hadi respond.
It's very difficult,
question.
but I'll try.
Yeah, thank you. So Pak Peter, please, you can respond.
I mean, I can't answer I put the last point that was about metaphors and equivalences and things in the form of a question. I don't know the answer to this. What I'm trying to fathom is I suppose the metaphysical presuppositions which underlie the way in which Javanese in this period talk about the world. And I think the question about the kidung, it takes these explanations of the world cast as kidung, and it's one of the basic almost just simply accepted custom that if one's explaining the world, then one sings a kidung or sings a kakawan. Now that there are differences between them, and again, there's so little work done on the kidung genre and its history at the moment. It's certainly, a lot of them are, the narratives are focused on royal courts, but as Joe has pointed out, they're not just they may not have just a royal or a courtly origin. I mean, all I'm trying to do at the moment is to, by looking at these texts, to work out what kinds of presuppositions these explanations of the world that turn up in the form of these metrical narratives inform them and explain why Javanese thought that way and presented their thoughts in this particular kind of way. So my question about metaphors and equivalences and things, it's a question I've got in my head. It's something that needs to be researched as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. And Pak Hadi.
Jara, two questions here. With regard to these three kidung, the Witaraga, the Wargasari, and the Panji Margasmara, they're quite unique. If you want to compare them with the other historical kidungs, like you mentioned, like the Manggolawe or the Harsawijaya, what I find, these three kidung, they're so authentic. There's an authenticity about them, which you can verify in the field. They mention well-known institutions. In the Wargasari, you have, as I said earlier, there are allusions. You've got the Dharma Dyatsa, you've got the Impu Padalagan. Now, this figure is known, very well known from the inscriptions and from the Desa Warnana. This is not to say that Wargasari himself was a historical figure, but it's an authentic. The office is authentic. The journey is authentic. The institutions, the archaeological sites can all be verified. This is more difficult when you're looking at the so-called historical kidungs. So I get the impression here that the authors, they had a special mission in the 15th century. One example, interesting example, the Panji Margasmara, where the author himself, he calls himself Kamuling Ratya Hataping Raje. This could be interpreted as someone who his work, his writing was tapa. He was performing tapa. He was performing tapa in Raje. I would say in modern Javanese, topo ingrame. So he was doing his tapa not in the cave. He was not running off to the cave to get enlightened. He was right there in the city, and his tapa was his karya, his work, his writing. So it was like a sort of a sacred mission, in a sense. It was a sacred duty to preserve something which he felt was disappearing, and he wanted to preserve it for posterity. And this is why in the Panji Margasmara you have mention of this famous mandala Kukub. You've got Mount Kulud, you've got Mount Kampu, Candi Panataram, all these very well-known institutions. They're all highlighted. So this is quite, and of course they're all journeys as well. So as I say, I think they're not historical in the same sense as the other kidung which you mentioned. But they're fictive, but they have historical content. The other question concerning the
sites.
The sites. Now, this is very interesting. There are in fact other sites which I could quote. I mean, this Umpak Balikambang is extraordinary. I mean, this date was only found a few years ago, so Dr. Brandes would never have. He didn't know about it, and in fact, it was only discovered by the father of the present caretaker. So it's only a very recent discovery. it's extraordinary. I mean, as I said, the argument is, I think the argument is incontestable because of that date, the date of Hayam Wuruk's consecration, his inauguration in that year. What other reason would they have built a monument, a building of that size in that year? Now, interestingly, there is a site exactly the same, and this also occurs in the Panji Margasmara at Bubat, the site of Bubat, which was where in the Panji Margasmara, the young king, he's inaugurated at Rabutpala, and then 3 or 4 months later, he's inaugurated, officially sanctioned as divine king, as Dewa Prabhu, at Bubat. And Bubat has the same site. There's a Balai Kamban, it's called Balai Kamban, Umpak Balai Kamban. There are 36 Umpak, and they're even bigger than the ones at Chandipur. And they're right, they haven't been excavated yet, but they were mentioned by Kromojoyo Adinegoro, and 3 of them are in the Museum of Kromoblan. The rest are still under the ground. We're waiting for the archaeologists to dig them up, but it's the plain of Bubat, and that's where, interestingly, the interesting parallel was that the king in, I didn't have time to mention it, but in fact, the young king in Panji Margasmara, he gets married at Bubat, on the plain of Bubat, which is, of course, an allusion once again to Hayam Wuruk's marriage in 1357. It seems to be an allusion, although that was an abortive marriage, but in this case, he actually marries and is inaugurated as king and it happened in the month of Chaitra. In the month of Chaitra, which is, of course, in the Desavarana, this was when the New Year festivities. So this was planned. And this is very interesting. This, once again, is possibly, we're getting historical data, the historical data in this Kidung Panji Margasmara, which is telling us about this was a custom. Perhaps royalty were married at Bubat. Perhaps this is something which was not uncommon. Perhaps they were inaugurated there too. These are all things which need to be explored. Certainly, the archaeological site is there, and you've got the same number of umpak at Sagala in the Wargasari at Jabung. I'm personally quite convinced that this is the Sagala which people have been searching for discussing for the last 100 years. Where was Sagala, the Dharma of Kartanagara? I think we have a good argument here that it was Sajabun. This was the Sajabun of Clara.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hadi. It's got really and more interested. I think I believe if Purbo Charoko is still alive here, he will revise his neglection to omit the historical site or archaeological sites because there are a lot of connection basically there. So, Pak Willem van der Molen, yeah, this is your turn. Before again, Bu Lydia also raised her hands. Pak Willem, please.
I'll hurry. There's been said a lot interesting things and inspiring things also from my own research. So thank to all the speakers for what they brought and the input from the persons asking questions. I have a small question for Ibu Clara, if you don't mind. Thank you very much for your enlightening story about difficulties faced by modern players, and I suppose also by yourself doing your research during Corona times and how they were overcome. And you mentioned one aspect of innovation, of renewal, and that was about the attributes. I wonder, 2 things. Was it only a renewal, like using a modern telephone, only about attributes, or was it also a renewal somehow to be detected in dramatic narratives? And the second question related is, you did not mention it, but could you tell something about the reception by the audience of these innovations?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So yeah, there was innovation in the narrative also Yeah, first because all the new issue of the pandemic came into the lakon. So I mean that because the performance was set in there was a mindset which was frame, and then a comical interlude, which was improvisation. And in this improvisation, with change at each performances, the dancers and the actors can innovate, and they innovate at each performances, adding some element of the pandemic. So I mean, it was the actors who decide at each show to add some new element. It could be from the COVID, it could be from new news information which came. It depends, I mean, but I mean that the plot changed at each performances because of this comical interlude, and so the dancers choose to add the special issue from the pandemic in the lakon. I don't know if it answers to your question.
Yes, it does. We can discuss more, but no, this is an answer. Thank you. And about the second thing, the reaction of the audience.
Oh yeah, so it was interesting because actually the audience don't really know about Panji's story, and don't know. They know Ande Lumut because it's a dongeng, so a folk tale for children. So most of them used to hear it when they were a child, but they didn't know that it was performed into the Wayang Topeng performance. So most of them discover it in the Sidomulyo Museum. And yeah, they attend to the show for the entertaining part. So they come as in the Wayang, when the audience come to see the Punaka one and the Gara-Gara, it's the same thing. The audience came to the performance to show the comical interlude. So even if there was some moral and Javanese ethics which were transmitted into this performance, the audience didn't care about it and come out just for the comical interlude, to see the Punaka ones, to see the cross-gender dancers, to see Burando Dadakan who do acrobatics and jumped all over the stage. They come for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Before Bu Lydia, actually, there is a question from Ika Anggredi to Clara. So we stick with Clara first before we return to Bu Lydia. Yeah, unfortunately, she's in the office right now, and yeah, she wrote some feedbacks there. Really interested with Miss Clara's presentation. Just an idea with weekly performance of Wayang Topeng in Sono Budoyo Museum every Saturday, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it can be initiated to bring Wayang Topeng to another cultural center in Jogja or other cities in Indonesia, like Solo or Jakarta, like Taman Mini or Museum Nasional or somewhere else. To that Dinas Kebudayaan of Jogja shouldn't mind to help to coordinate. Could grow as festival Wayang Topeng or collaborated with other form of Wayang Yogyakarta traditional dance or else. Clara, you might to respond it.
Yeah, I mean, there was some cultural event in Yogyakarta organized to promote the Wayang Topeng performances. So, I mean, this show is not the first one in Jogja and in Jabal. So there was some special event a few years ago specialized on Wayang Topeng performances. After to respond, I don't know how to respond actually. But of course, there is some Wayang Topeng festival also in Solo, so it can be it can bring links, actually, that's sure. It depends of the artist also, it depends of the collaboration. But actually, I don't know how to respond to this, and I'm sorry.
Okay, Clara, maybe I also want to, before return to Lydia, or Lydia, you want to address Clara or the other discussions?
Actually, I have a few. I just want to make it very brief.
Okay,
Time. Just to sang the umpak, the Balikambang. Sangran have been years ago. Maybe you can reply to this other place. Sangran, when you are heading to Sidomulyo, Tulung Agung, it's a bus. Do you remember?
Oh, Lydia, the connection, I think it's not good in my side.
Oh, it's bad. Me?
Okay, maybe you can write the question for the sites. Yeah, I only
hear
heard.
me. Okay, so I have few all right. Okay.
Okay, I only heard about the sites near my hometown at Tulung Agung. Actually, I was born at Tulung Agung, so there is I believe there is a site that Bu Lydia will write and relate with other sites of Balikambang, as mentioned in the discussion of Pak Hadi and Jarah earlier. But before we read the, Pak Hadi, Bu Lydia actually have written down in the chat room. Pak Hadi, another umpak-umpak the Candi Sangran, is it related also with the umpak at the Penataran, or related with other stories with Panji? Do you have any comment, Pak Hadi?
Not really. The size of the umpak at the interesting point I was trying to make was the connection between the umpak at Bupat and the umpak at Penataran, which are the two sites where the king was inaugurated. In the Panji Margasmara, they call the umpak the Penataran, and it's interesting that the name of the temple now is Candi Penataran. It could be that even that the Penataran is the name which has survived, because it was a place where the king, well, we know from the Desa Warnana that Hayam visited every year. He went to Pala, and quite possibly he camped at his Penataran, which is where this Umpak Balikambang was built specially for him, and then continued. It was maybe a tradition which continued on into the 15th century. And same at Bupat. Every year there were festivities at Bupat in the month of Chaitra, and king would mount this stage and big stage, and there was a huge building there, the same dimensions as the one at Balikambang at Penataran. The one at Sangrahan, I don't know if we could say the same thing about this. That the context is not clear to me. Interestingly, the one at Jabung, though, is once again the number of umpak is the same, 35, 36, building of almost the same dimensions. And this was usually, in this case, was on the western side of the eastern, on the western side of the temple complex. But this was in Bali today. We still talk about the Penataran. The Penataran is like a long building which is usually connected to the temple, and it was a place where various activities take place. Yeah. So there's a context there. I think for the one at Sangrahan, I'm not sure about. I wouldn't like to say. I wouldn't like to comment there.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, then I hope it's already discussed yet. And because Pak Wardiman also mentioned by Bu Lydia actually in the chat room, it's about also respond to the Ika Anggraini feedbacks about the performance of Wayang Topeng. Actually, Pak Wardiman had organized some of them recently during the festivities of the Hari Wayang Kulit Dunia, and maybe later we also invite Pak Wardiman because he also appear in this meeting room to respond it. Pak Wardiman, hello Pak Wardiman, are you still here Pak Wardiman? Because he's still he was the first of the participants in this meeting actually who entered this meeting room. I mean, are you still here, Pak Wardiman? Or maybe the later, you can address these feedbacks from Ika. But I will back to Clara again. Clara, actually, I really intriguing about your main topic of your dissertation actually, because I believe this speech actually one of your chapter, isn't it? And how about the main of them? Because you also mentioned before about how Panji, actually the Wayang Topeng or the performance at least Panji now look or appreciated at the one of characteristic of Kejawaan of the Javanese cultural heritage. As far as I know, and when I was, as far as I experienced since I was a child and since the reborn of Panji in Jawa, there was actually a long time, a vacancy or a long time vacancy of the discussion, or there is actually very little discussion on Panji during the 1960s to 1990 or even in the early 2000s in Java itself. So I'm wondering how nowadays the government or the peoples even look at Panji as one of the cultural heritage or main part of Kejawaan. So that's what I want to think.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think that the recent revival of and the recent interest in Panji history in Yogyakarta and Central Java is linked with the patrimonialization of the Panji history at the UNESCO as Memory of the World in 2017, and the entering of Panji tales in the UNESCO World Heritage highlight the importance of these stories in Java is what I saw when I worked in Yogyakarta in the first time, and in the second time, in fact, in Yogyakarta, some dance groups still transmit the Wayang Topeng performance and Panji story. They didn't actually stop. They just wait for comment and for sponsor, in fact. But the dance is still in Jogja, and the dancers still know the dance actually, and they still transmit the story. They just waiting for opportunities to transmit it. But nowadays the thing is that the main sponsor of the Panji performances and Wayang Topeng performances are the Dinas Kebudayaan, and so it's linked the Panji as a cultural heritage, as a form of entertainment. So I mean, even if the actors and the dancers want to transmit the Javanese values and Javanese ethic, which are linked with the Panji story, it's very complicated for them because they have to follow the guideline of the creative industry if they want to perform. And yeah, nowadays I didn't saw sponsored who asked for a long-term performances. I mean the 7 hours one. They just asked for tali topeng, just 1 hour, or just entertaining performances. So yeah, that's the problem. What I saw, in fact, in Yogyakarta. I don't know if it answers to your question or not.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, yeah, maybe there is a lot of discussion actually I want to follow.
Mm.
But anyway, yeah, because I really worry that we will running out of time. It's almost only 2 minutes from the expected times of our discussion. But is Pak Wardiman, I back to Pak Wardiman first, is he already here or not? Okay, but yeah, I will return it to Bu Lydia, and before I return to Bu Lydia, actually, I really personally thank you to all of the speakers and also all of the participants here, to Pak Willem, Mas Wayanjara, and also Mbak Ika, who participated in the discussion, that really show us once again that Panji is still really alive, even there is actually in Indonesia, as Clara also told you before, that only the states that officially promotes Panji as cultural heritage, but in the academic discussion, at least, it's still lively. There are many things that we can continue or to follow this discussion up to many probabilities and many opportunities in your future. So, Bu Lydia, maybe you want to continue this discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe extend it more, 5 more minutes. Is that okay? There be many things to be told. Also, a few remarks. I see how you're there. But first of all, I just want to give a brief outcome. Not which has the is Panji. Yeah, of the and the same is not every title of Panji makes part of a Panji story. The same on the cap. Many people every where kept is a Panji. No, yeah, this is one of I think we also hope you get. Can you understand? No? No? Just move. Sorry. I get it. I get it close to the router. You hear me now?
Yeah, sometimes still you are lost and back again.
Maybe I will write it later.
Okay. And I see that Pak Wardiman is already here. Maybe Pak Wardiman. Yeah, do you want to add something?
No,
as
I
a
just
closing
want.
statement.
Yeah, I want just to close it. Appreciate Wachana in making this seminar and keep Panji always high. I am active in the other side of Panji, and that is how to reactivate Panji in other daerah, in other regions. Yeah, that is where I am very active in. Yeah. But thank you for all the speakers. It's interesting, and we hope that we can always discuss about Panji in the future. Thank you, Pa Adrian.
Thank you, Pak Wardiman. And yeah, again, thanks to you all. And before I return it to the Wacana team, and actually I have one feedback in my private chat that And it's also reminds me on the earlier discussion with Bu Lydia and Pak Willem, and also with Bu Lili and Bu Susi and Tim Wacana, about how to arrange or organize these groups. I mean, this member, this participant, the discussions here into a kind of more intensive communication in the WhatsApp group or social media group. I think because I believe it is not only, I mean, the idea to make or to keep Panji tradition alive, but also will inspire. I mean, in many of our works also, I believe so. And with the WhatsApp group or social media group, we can have this kind of discussion. We can arrange this kind of discussion later, and even more intense, rather than only once a year as we did previously. If you want to join it, maybe Tim Wacana or I will also arrange this into that kind of group, and yeah, we will stay in touch, and perhaps we can also arrange or contribute some things in journals or some things in books, or some things even like this in near future. Okay, that's for me. Really thanks again for all of your participation and attendance. So now I'm back to Wacana team, Bu Susi or Bu Lili now. Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody. It's rainy hard in Jakarta and Depok, so thank you for joining us today. So we have to meet you again in the next occasion of Wacana. Thank you, Ibu Lydia, all the speakers, Pak Hadi Sidomulyo, Pak Peter Worsley, and Clara, Gilbert. Also, thank you, Adrian Perkasa, for moderate the discussion, and of course, Van der Molen and the whole team of Wacana. And thank you, everybody. And Leah will take a photo session for all of us.
Hello.
Can everyone
Yeah.
open the video? iPhone 1 and Pak Agung Wibowo. Okay. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. Oh, Bu Lydia. Bu Lydia. Kemana? Okay. Oh, with the mask. We're counting down. 1, 2, 3. Smiles. Once again. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Is my voice
yes,
moment?
It's still unstable.
I put get as a lot of flowers. Enough nurture them. Thank
okay.
you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Stay healthy.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Adrian masih di Leiden.
Masih Pak, masih terjebak
Oke.
di sini musim dingin Pak. Insya Allah Pak. Mohon doanya biar segera selesai Pak.
Iya, biar cepat selesai. Gitu. Oke. Ini bagus
Terima
lah.
kasih Pak Wardiman.
Oh, iya Bu.
Iya.
Saya di bidang Panji yang lain Bu, yaitu bagaimana membangkitkan Panji.
Ya, itu penting juga Pak. Ya.
Jadi
Terima
nanti
kasih.
tahun depan kita ada program di 4 tempat, jadi Kediri, Malang, Jogja dan Solo lah, mengadakan pekan Panji di masing-masing tempat gitu.
Oke, Ibu Lydia harus datang berarti ke Indonesia.
Ya. Nanti datanya di-share Pak Wardiman. Kapan itu? Iya.
Boleh. Nanti kita.
Ya. Nanti jadwalnya disampaikan. Oke.
Betul.
Ya. Terima kasih Pak semua,
Mari.
Pak Hadi Sidomulyo, Bu Lydia,
Terima kasih,
sehat-sehat
sama-sama.
semua.
Ya Pak Hadi, terima kasih.
Pak Hadi,
Ya, dari dulu cuman baca bukunya, belum pernah ketemu ya.
Ya Pak Hadi.
Ya.
Ya, sehat selalu semua.
Ya.
Terima kasih.
Yang mau sampaikan tadi sayang sekali Clara sudah keluar karena itu selama pandemi banyak yang dilakukan oleh Pak Panji.
Ya.
Ya, tadi contoh selama pandemi.
Putus-putus Ibu Lydia.
Oke.
Ya, oke. Baiklah, sampai jumpa lagi. Saya tutup Zoom saya.
Bye.
Bye.
Terima kasih banyak.
Terima kasih Bu Lydia semua.